In the last video, we talked about inductive and deductive reasoning. We talked about the scientific method. Deductive reasoning and the scientific method are great for things that are reproducible and measurable. So with the scientific method, we can set up the process of experimentation and reproduce the conditions, reproduce the situation in order to observe and measure changes. So we can come to conclusive results with that. Inductive reasoning, as I said, was based on observation, strict observation, and interpretation of those observations and what is found. Now this also brings us to the difference between a law and a theory. In science we have both laws and theories. Now we have the law of gravity. The law of gravity, although we can't easily reproduce Earth's gravitational pull, this would be inductive reasoning because we can observe and then interpret the observations. However, those observations, in this case, in the case of the law of gravity, every single time we observe something jumping, it returns to the Earth. Something we drop goes immediately to the Earth. So it's not reproducible in the sense that we can reproduce the Earth's gravitational pull, but those observations are reproducible. Every time we observe something that doesn't have an object in between it and the Earth, it falls to the Earth. Gravity always works. So we know that gravity is a law. There are laws of gravity. However, there are things that, like I've said, that are not reproducible and measurable. So we come up with theories. We make observations and we interpret those and we come up with a theory. Now when we think of the origins of the universe, the origins of species, these are things where theory comes into play. We have laws also, the laws of thermodynamics. For example, the law of thermodynamics that states that in all systems, things go from order to disorder unless an outside energy force is acted upon it. This is a law because every time this is observed, we see those same results. Houses over time deteriorate unless an outside energy force is added to it. Unless you work hard to keep that house going and keep it up to date, it deteriorates. We see this in nature. We see it in all aspects of science and engineering. So it's a law. But again, we think of the scientific laws, theories, observations that go into the origins of the universe. How do we determine that? We can't reproduce the universe. We can't reproduce the beginnings of the species. So this is where observation and interpretation come in. Now when we think of the Big Bang Theory, for example, and I know I'm going to oversimplify this, but the Big Bang Theory came about because when the distance between galaxies and stars is measured over time, it is observed that the universe is expanding. Okay, so that's something observable and measurable. Not reproducible in the sense that we can reproduce that in a lab, but it is observable and reproducible over time as that's measured. The universe is expanding. Now here's where interpretation comes in. If the universe is expanding out, then if we reverse time and we want to go back to the origins of the universe, the idea is that if it's expanding out now, then reversing time would be shrinking back to a center point, to a point at which this whole thing began, a Big Bang, if you will, that set the whole thing into motion. So again, this is a theory. This is not a law. This is not provable because it's not reproducible and measurable in that regard, in the scientific method regard. So it's observation and interpreting those observations. But when making those interpretations, you also have to ask tough questions. Okay, if the universe is expanding out now and over time this is measurable, well, is it currently expanding at the same rate from what we can measure? Is it increasing its expansion? Is it slowing? Is it growing exponentially? These are things we have to look at and measure. But then we ask the question, okay, if it's expanding out, then did it really just start in a center point and expand out from there? Or is there some sort of, I guess, wobble effect, you could say, where it expands out and then contracts, expands, contracts? Is that happening? Is that something that can be observed? So that's where interpretation comes in to try to figure out and determine possibly what may have happened. When you think of evolutionary theory and the origin of species, there are things that are observable. We can observe over time that species do actually have genes that mutate. And sometimes those mutations are advantageous for adapting to their surroundings. One of the famous examples that was observed in science is the peppered moth. In Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution, the peppered moth prior to that was mostly white and kind of speckled with grays and blacks. However, there's a mutation that occurred that produced a black moth, and that black moth reproduced and continued to make more black moths. But during the Industrial Revolution, especially in areas of where there was a lot of industry in the urban settings, those moths survived because they actually blended into their surroundings with all the soot that was building up on the trees and the buildings, and so they actually survived well and adapted to their surroundings. The white peppered moths did not do well in the urban settings, but it continued to thrive in the country. So that's an adaptation, mutation that occurred, that was observed, and there are many, many examples like that in nature. Charles Darwin, who is best known for his Origin of Species and evolutionary theory, was not someone who made up this idea. It actually existed before him, and he learned from others, but he was the one who put it into writing. Now, as he set out on the Beagle, the ship that sailed around the Galapagos Islands and around much of the world to make some observations, he observed on the Galapagos Islands, in different islands, the finches, for example, had differently shaped beaks. And those beaks were advantageous for the type of plants that were growing on that specific island. He also observed this with tortoises and iguanas and other animals that lived on these islands. From island to island, they were slightly different, and those differences seemed to help them adapt to their surroundings and the resources that were available on that island. So from that and other things, he began to formulate his theory of evolution. Now here's where observation and interpretation come in. He observed those differences from island to island. His interpretation led him to his theory of evolution. Now, as I said, there are aspects of this that are observable, and when they're observed over time, we see that this idea of mutation and adaptation does reproduce over time. So there are some, I guess you could say, some laws of evolution that are understandable. However, when we get to the origin of species, this is something that is not observable, that we cannot observe species morphing into others in a way that we can conclusively come to the understanding that all species had the same origin. One little cell called life that began to spread out and evolve into all the other various forms of life. That's not reproducible, not measurable. So that's interpretive. And that's where theory comes into play. That it's a theory of the origin of species